And welcome back to another episode of Life Changing Challengers. Again, I'm your host, Brad Minus, as always. But I am so lucky and privileged to have Allison Yamamoto. And she is a mentor, a coach, entrepreneur, and she deals a lot with REDS. Now, REDS is an acronym, and we're going to get to that. And we're not going to talk about it right now because I always have to ask the same question. Is first, Allison, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm fantastic. So, as I ask most of my guests, Allison, can you tell us a little about your childhood? Where you grew up, what was the compliment of your family, and what was it like to be Allison as a kid?
Yes, so I love where I grew up. I grew up in California, and I feel like that has been very embedded in my identity ever since. So specifically, I grew up in San Diego, and I come from a very active family. And so sometimes I joke that I'm the least athletic person in my family, which speaks a lot more to how athletic my family is, I would say. Where my mom is a swimmer, my dad is into climbing. He's done surfing and running and biking, and then my brother has done lifeguarding, and so they're all very, very active. And I similarly grew up being very active as well. And so I dabbled around in different things, but a lot of what I was doing, especially in my younger years, was dance and then eventually cheerleading. So definitely different than a lot of the sports that my family was participating in. So I ended up cheering all throughout high school and college and finding my way into endurance sports slightly later in life. So after I graduated, getting much more, there we go. Yeah. Joined the team, getting into running and then eventually cycling as well. But I would say that running was my main thing. And I think that one of the things I'm really grateful for is that because I grew up in California, it was so easy to be outside. So that's also something that's a very big theme in my childhood and in who I am today, which is that I love to be outside doing outside sports, but even doing things like camping or hiking or anything that involves getting out into nature, which is sort of ironic because now I'm living in New York City where a lot of that stuff isn't as accessible as I'm used to. But I would say that that was really prominent in my childhood, and so something that was probably the inspiration for starting to get more involved in endurance type activities.
Awesome. Yes, and an endurance athlete, obviously near and dear to my heart. I've been doing it for a while. I've been coaching for 15 years, so I get it. And I love endurance athletes. I don't know what it is about it. I think it's the fact that you know, there are so few in that top 5% that are competitive and they're like racing for money and the whole bit that the rest of us are just trying to beat ourselves. We're just trying to beat the last time we did that race, right? We just want to do better than we did before. Yes, okay, competition helps, but on the whole, all we want to do is we want to beat our last time. That's it. So there's competition, but not competition. So we're all nice to each other. Like we just want you to do better.
Yep.
So
And I think that's actually a really good point because I think that so one of the things I didn't mention about my childhood that I think is also actually relevant is that I also was really kind of a high achiever type. So when I was growing up, I put a lot of pressure on myself to do well in school and to do well in my extracurriculars and to kind of follow the path of like getting into a good school and really trying to have a lot of maybe like achievements or do well by the standards that I felt like I was setting on myself or my school was setting on myself. And I think that that is also something that probably influenced me going into endurance related activities because there's that element where whether it's during training or during races that you can be a little bit self-competitive for better or for worse, as we'll probably get into. But that is something that can be really interesting is how you can set those goals for yourself and achieve them and that can and learn about yourself along the way. And I think that that's something that for me was very much related to something that's been very embedded in my character from growing up, as back to your question about childhood.
okay. Well, let's just say stereotype much. Okay. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay. Just you know what? Fun fact. My first year of college, I was a cheerleader.
Really?
varsity cheerleader. Yep.
No way.
And then, yep, tried out again. And unfortunately, so I'm 5'8", which is not a good base, right? Um, so the next year when I tried out, I didn't make it. And I saw the other people that competed, and I was like, they're not that great. Why did I not get picked? So I went to talk to the coach, and she goes, Brad, I wanted to pick you so bad. The problem was everybody else was 6'1" or higher. I said, and they're perfect. So they all line up. I can't have this in the lineup. I can't do that.
Yeah.
So they're like, she goes, it's not nothing against your abilities. You're great. I loved you last year, but I've got all the guys are all the same height. And that's what I have to, and if I can get them to do that, it's going to be much better for the girls. So that was it. And it was my first introduction to, pick your battles, and that sometimes, even though you might be a good candidate or might even be the best candidate, you might not get it for other reasons, for the picture, the whole picture, not just the individual picture. So that was my first thing. That we're going off on a tangent there, but yeah, so that was my first thing. But so yeah, so when you said that you cheerleaded all the way through, so um, but yeah, so started with this, what was it, Standing Liberty, and you know,
Yeah.
um, Fair, and QP, and got to do all that cool stuff, and then yeah, so it was fun. It was a blast, I will say. It was a blast. Had a good time.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very interesting juxtaposition from endurance because in cheerleading there is that aspect of focus, more explicit focus, I guess I'll say, on the aesthetic than you might see as explicitly in endurance sports, where people are giving you very clear and unfiltered feedback on your aesthetic and how that fits in and how that influences the picture, how that influences things. And I think that that is definitely an interesting experience. And I think that there are aspects where there are probably like implicit standards, or there's people that we see in endurance that set a sort of expectation around physicality, but in cheerleading it's like very, very explicit, and you are the face of the poster that you're on or the representation of the school. And so there is some of that feedback that can happen in the cheerleading space about, to your point on like your own experiences and how you're getting judged for the aesthetic that you're contributing to the squad.
That's a great way to put it, is the aesthetic, right? So, I might have been talent wise, I might have been good for the team, but aesthetic wise, because she was able to fund it, to not fund it, but to fill the team with guys that were 6'1" and big, the aesthetic wouldn't have been, what she wanted it to be. It also, and as far as technique goes, it would have put a little wrench into it as well.
Hmm.
Just for me being 5'8" down here trying to do cradles, and and QPs, and trying to lift cheerleaders up, and everybody else is up here and I'm down here. So yeah, so it's aesthetic. Exactly. It's exactly what it was. So safety, maybe to a point, but it was fun. So, but let's put it out this way. You and I can agree, cheerleading is a sport.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's definitely something that requires a lot of athletic ability, and I actually think that it's probably gotten more attention and athletic credibility in more recent years because of how much is going on in terms of TV shows or documentaries that are putting out some of the more athletic capabilities that go into cheer, and also some of the dangers. It's a extremely dangerous activity to participate in, but that was something that during my high school and college years felt more controversial for sure about whether or not it was something that was considered a sport. And for me personally, I don't care that strongly about whether we categorize it specifically in either direction, as much as it's undeniably something that requires a lot of athleticism. And so at the end of the day, how we want to label it is less important. That it's definitely something that's challenging, and especially at those more elite levels, what people are doing is incredible. It's just beyond things that you would think people are capable of.
Oh, and of course, my feed is, it's filled with these girls doing just these, and guys doing these amazing things where they're up and down and up and down. I mean, for us back then, I'm a little bit older than you. Um, and back then it was a one up. You know what I mean? You 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 jump the stump, you jump the stunt, and you cradled next stunt. Now they're doing the stuff where they're down and back up, and then they bring them back down and they pump back up to, and it's incredible. It's not just this, up, cradle, done. It's up, bounce, bounce, and it's really amazing. And I love watching it, but yeah, it fills my feed now, which is fun. So, so what did you end up studying in college? Where did you go to college first?
So I went to Berkeley.
Nice. And what did you end up studying?
I studied business administration and computer science. So it was two different degrees, I guess. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. I have an MBA with an emphasis on IT management. So here we have another little connection there. I like that. Um, so that's great. So what did you end up doing with it? Did you end up actually going into business, into some sort of management role? And how did how did that start out after college?
Yeah. So I ended up going and having a sort of parallel path. And I think that that was a lot based on the fact that in a lot of my experiences, I had sort of had the academic minded, sort of extracurricular school oriented side of me. And then I'd always had this more activity, athletic movement side of me. And so, in a similar vein, when I graduated, ended up having those two different paths where one was I ended up getting really involved in the fitness community, and the other was how I had pursued my career. And they ended up kind of interweaving and intersecting at various times. But at the beginning, right when I graduated from college, I did go into like corporate roles and was doing work in the tech industry, being from Silicon Valley. And that was a really amazing experience. It was something where I was definitely challenged. I felt like I was using a lot of the things that I had learned in school, and it taught me a lot about being in a corporate job and being in a position where you're working alongside in like a very conventional corporate situation where you're navigating the dynamics and the culture within that specific company, how those change from company to company, but also the pressure that you can experience within the standards that are either set for you specifically or the ones that are set by the organization, and how that evolves and changes based on the stage of the company or the role that you're in. And so that was something that I'd pursued. And for a long time, I really did think that my ambition was to be I've always been very interested in health as well. So I did really want to be a leader at a company that was focused in the health industry. And I got to the point where I learned a lot throughout my career about what I liked, what I didn't like, what was sustainable, what wasn't sustainable. But that same kind of thread about wanting to be a high achiever, wanting to meet the standards that I set for myself was very much something I applied to my career. And what I underestimated was how much the fitness side of everything and how I was pursuing fitness and pursuing nutrition and my interest in that area in parallel to the career oriented. I didn't realize how much those actually intersected and very much impacted one another. And because in my life I had siloed those in a very not necessarily intentional, but it wasn't that I was going to work and spending the entire time working on things that were directly and very clearly impacting how I was showing up in my training. Or it wasn't that I was doing a training for a marathon, for example, and then thinking, oh, this is something I'm explicitly doing because I think it's going to influence or benefit or in any way influence the way that I was navigating my career position. And I very much underestimated how much those two things in my life were intertwining in terms of how they're impacting each other, but also intertwining in terms of how the skills I was developing in each of those areas could be cohesive and come together in a really beneficial way, ultimately, eventually.
Okay. That is, I mean, that's amazing. So, I mean, I've been there, most of us are like that, right? We've got our job and you've got to find training around it, right? And, mm, for me, obviously getting up in the morning, getting my workout in affected my day. And the days I didn't get up and do my workout also affected my day. Is that basically what you were experiencing? But because you said somehow that they did become cohesive but yet not cohesive. So why don't you talk to me a little bit more about that and how you felt about that,
Yeah.
about the impact plus the and where you found the cohesiveness.
Yeah. So I think there's sort of 2 different areas where there was cohesiveness. And so one, I'll talk about where there was maybe not so great cohesiveness, and then the other I'll talk about where there was really helpful and beneficial cohesiveness, where I think that as endurance athletes especially, and or anyone who's really focused on their health and their health journey, that there is a normalization to that word discipline is the same thing as pushing through. And so we, especially in sort of the athletic side of things or where we're doing workouts, often praise people for being like, okay, well, even if you have a bad day, or even if you're feeling tired, or even if you've worked out the previous however many days, that discipline looks like pushing through and doing what you have to do, regardless of any other factors that may be coming into play. And more is always better. And that kind of becomes a narrative that is seeps into our culture a little bit when it comes to our workouts. And on the other hand, on the food side of things, there's so much information on what's right, what's wrong, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, what's going to kill you, what's going to be the game changer in terms of solving every single one of your problems. And a lot of that information can be overwhelming and hard to navigate. What applies to me, what doesn't apply to me, what's going to help me, what isn't going to help me, what's taking into consideration who I am as a person, whether it's that I am a menstruating person or whether it's that I'm active and I'm doing a lot of other activity. But I think that what ended up happening for me is for a period of that time, I was ignoring a lot of signs that were indicating to me that the way that I was showing up in fitness was impacting my life in general. And they were never something that I felt like was bad enough that I needed to drop everything and prioritize it. And in fact, it was something where I thought that I was the pinnacle of what I needed to be in terms of health because I was really thinking about it and because I was really educated about, trying to seek the information and trying to get more disciplined and more strategic in my training, that there were little things that happened that were influencing my broader life. And that could be everything to how I was feeling emotionally, to how I was navigating burnout, to the amount of stress that I was experiencing, to my energy levels. And I didn't realize at the time how much that had been playing a role in impacting other areas of my life. So that was one area where like the cohesion may not have been as beneficial, but it definitely was something where the two sides were impacting one another, where like the pressures I was putting on myself on work would come out and result in coping strategies that might impact my workouts. And then on the other hand, is that the way I was navigating nutrition and the way I was navigating my workouts was also impacting the burnout I was experiencing at work and the way that I was showing up with energy levels and how I was showing up throughout the day. I would say that the way that they came together more cohesively is that eventually it took me on a journey where I did get more appropriate and credible information about what actually applied to me specifically when it came to nutrition and when it came to my fitness. That when I was able to apply those in combination with a lot of the things that I learned from navigating a more business oriented side of things for a while, that it enabled me to put together the business that I have today. And so that is something I am really grateful for. And that was an area where I felt like those two things ultimately ended up colliding in a way that I never would have expected because it wasn't something that I intentionally had tried to set up for success later on earlier in my career.
Okay, so let's step back and why don't you tell us a story? Once upon a time, Allison was training for a marathon and she was working at a company doing her tech job, which I think you were what, a product manager
Yep.
for a while?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was doing her product management job. And all of a sudden, take it away.
Yeah. So there was a period of time, to your point, where I was working in tech and I was also training for half marathons, marathons. I was running a decent amount. And I was also, to what I'd alluded to earlier, trying to be really strategic about my diet. And I never personally would have formalized the identity of being someone who was on a diet as much as someone who was really interested in my health. And what that ended up resulting in is a situation where I was really hesitant to take days off from training, and it would cause me a lot of anxiety if I felt like I needed to do that, or stress even if I had to change things around in my training. So I got to a point where I realized that I felt that there was rigidity and guilt affiliated with how I was showing up to my workouts and how I was showing up around food. And that was where that guilt was continuing to manifest in feeling like I was even more stuck in this routine that I had been navigating. And I think that a lot of, to the point that I was making earlier about the amount of information that exists and the amount of kind of prescriptive language that we may even recognize consciously or not around what's right or wrong when it comes to our fitness and when it comes to our nutrition, is what had really fueled this mentality that I had that was ultimately leading to a state where I was under fueling and I was overtraining. And in some cases, people are experiencing just one or the other. And in my case, it was probably a combination of the two that was maybe more on the overtraining side at some points or more on the feeling side at others, but something that happened for several years. And that was showing up in these signs that I was mentioning were fairly easy to ignore. And yet, what I had underestimated were what the health risks were and the health consequences of being in a state like that, especially for a chronic or prolonged period of time. And when I was getting more educated, like once I started to get more educated about REDS, which essentially is this more diagnostic based term that we would use to describe the state that I was experiencing, is is something that is worth prioritizing and really looking out for whether or not those are signals that you may be experiencing, and prioritizing trying to correct for those, because the amount of consequences that that can result in is pretty broadly impacting in a way that I hadn't realized for a very, very long period of time.
Okay, so what I'm getting from you is basically that you were like all of us, right? We had a plan. We knew that we had to do a certain workouts at a certain time, at a certain pace. And if we missed those workouts, we felt guilty, right? And
Exactly.
then if the workout felt too easy, sometimes we would either do it again or we do something else in the evening. So because we're like, wait, that did not feel right. That felt too easy. I got to do something else. So we're constantly training, trying to get better and better and better. And then what I'm starting to get at is that you started to feel like overtraining. I mean, we all felt it. I've been there, and you start to feel lethargic, and all of a sudden things are foggy. But yet, one of the two things is working for you, right? Your workouts are good, but when you get to work, you're like in this fog and you're like, what is going on? I'm usually great at work. I'm usually great with my workouts. And then you went into, instead of focusing on the metrics of fitness, it sounds like after you were educated, you started to focus more on the, the effects of your health, and what to do to make sure that you were feeling good all the time.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I think that that hits on a really important point, which is that a lot of the times when we're getting in these states where we're overtraining, there's a very short-sighted view. To your point on, "I need to do this thing today. This is what I need to do today, and that is what success is gonna look like." Or if you are one of those people who tends to, let's say the training program says you're gonna go for X amount of miles, and then you should feel really easy, and it should feel easy. Like that is what success would look like there. But then we're used to feeling like, "Oh no, I know I could challenge myself harder, and so I'm going to." And it almost becomes this hamster wheel where we're optimizing too much for how does it feel right now today versus that longer winded view of, well, how is this going to impact my training overall? How is this going to impact the other goals that I have in my life, whether it's related to my career or even if it's related to my training, just a longer perspective when we think about it, or even the health risks that I alluded to earlier. So even taking a really longer view of how could this impact me in 5 years, in 3 years, or in 10 years. And so taking that approach and becoming more educated about all those different angles is what was really game changing for me in terms of deciding to focus more on what is going to correct for all of those things versus what is going to make me feel satisfied with what I had done today.
And I totally get that. And that is that's basically that applies to everybody. That is a total application to men and women. We all go through overtraining if we're very focused on our fitness and certain metrics that we want to hit by certain amount of times, or it's just like how we feel after a workout. Some of us feel like, hey, listen, if I'm not sweating, if I'm not out of breath, and I'm not like shaking because I've like gotten I've taxed all my muscles, I didn't do a good enough job in my workout, which is not right. And I'll be the first person to say it. Specificity, and I'm big on that with my clients. But everything is specified. You have a recovery run. Yeah, at the end, you should feel like you still want to go more, but you don't because you're in recovery. There's a word there, and that's huge.
Yeah.
Now, but there is a difference now as we take the approach of women and men. Okay.
Mhm.
And this is where you've come up with, or you had felt the effects of reds. So can you tell us a little bit about what is reds and what you felt? What was your personal feeling of when you figured out that, yes, this is what I'm going through?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I did want to respond to, because I thought it was a really good point, is that it when we go back to the topic on overtraining, is that it's something that can very much happen to anyone. And I love that point that you raised, because a lot of the times what I hear from people is, well, I'm not some elite athlete. There's no way that this could be happening to me. Or I'm not, name somebody who's doing something crazier. And so therefore, like, I could never be overtraining. And actually, what I see in practice is that there are a lot of people who are not identifying themselves as somebody who's working out at the level where they could be overtraining, that are actually making these mistakes. And I think that it can be a product of what workout plan that they're doing or what classes they're attending, that aren't necessarily thinking about how that programming might fit into a longer regimen. Or if you aren't training for something, then it almost could put you at more risk, because then every single day, to your point, it's harder to know what is exactly this purpose for the workout if it isn't to feel like, okay, well, then I'm just going to go as hard as I can today because that's what makes me feel like I've gotten a workout in. And so I just like to bring that up, because sometimes we have biases about, oh, well, I couldn't be overtraining, or this is what these are the types of people that could be overtraining. And I see overtraining on people across the spectrum in terms of how much they would identify as being an athlete, or how much the output they're putting in. But to go back to your question on reds. So it's a very good point as well, that reds is something that could apply to anyone and any gender. And the reason that that's worth highlighting, and I think the reason that you brought that up specifically, is that reds is an evolution of another term called female athlete triad, which was a slightly more widely known term. So some of you may have heard of it, but they actually had changed it from female athlete triad to be renamed to reds, because it is something that isn't just applied to females or to people who are menstruating. And what it stands for technically is relative energy deficiency in sport. But what it ultimately is in its essence is a situation where you are either overtraining and or you are underfueling, which goes to show that you could be at pretty low levels of activity and actually still experience reds, because you might be mismanaging your nutrition. And so it is not something that just happens to elite athletes. It's not something that just happens to females, but it is something that can happen across the spectrum. And being in a state where you are chronically in this state of underfueling, or where you're chronically overtraining, can have long-term health consequences and risks, which is what brings reds into the conversation of like diagnostic criteria, and how you might be experiencing physiologically anything from increased risk of injury, because it can cause bone weaknesses or early onset osteopenia, all the way through to potential like cardiovascular risks later on. But it also is impacting like much more in the now of how people are experiencing their everyday. And so this could be everything from feeling dips in your energy to brain fog. It could be maladaptive training responses. So you're actually not really able to recover the way that you would expect, which means that you're not really able to gain the fitness that you're probably trying to gain by doing the workouts that you're doing, all the way through to irritability. It can impact your mental health, your mood. It can impact actually the way that you're not just like whether you're gaining muscle or not, but it can even put you in a state where it's impacting your digestion. You might have indigestion because of it. It could impact your body might start to ironically induce more fat storage because it thinks it's in the state of survival. And so I always like to bring kind of those two sides to it, because for some people it's like very much the long-term health risks are something that's really compelling and really inspires people to take action. But for others, it's like even if you were to not care too much about those things or feel like that's not something you'd have to prioritize right now, there are real reasons in the present moment that the being in a state of reds could actually be impairing your ability to achieve some of the goals you might have right now today. That is something that we don't often talk about, because at the same time we might be thinking, well, I'm doing all these things because I think it's necessary to achieve these goals. And yet, sometimes if you are experiencing something like underfueling or something like overtraining, it in many cases could actually be inhibiting the goals that you're going after.
Exactly. And I loved how you had talked earlier about that. You had said that, some people might fall into a position of a phase of reds because they're not getting enough nutrition. And then there's some people that will fall into a phase of reds because they're overtraining. And you said that, well, no, I think I was a little bit of both. And I think that's more the case because if you really think about it, right? So I've got these ultra marathoners, right? And it'll be very simply, they can go 20 miles a day, 5 days a week, no issues, right?
Mhm.
No problems. Of course, they built up to that. So let's put that on the table. This is not something that they just started doing. But they'll go 20 miles a day without a problem, and they're burning up, 12 to 15,000 calories per day working out, and they could easily do that. Well, it's very hard to put that back.
Mhm.
So you end up actually not getting the nutrition you need no matter what you're doing, because sometimes that overtraining has you losing so much nutrition, so much sweat, so many calories that you can't possibly put that all back. And especially if you're an ultra marathoner that has a job, that has an 8 hour job, because you're not only getting all that stuff, you're either doing working out before and after work, which is a lot of what they do. Then they got 8 hours a day and only half hour or whatever to eat lunch, and they're eating lunching at their desk.
Yeah.
You can't possibly get those calories back. So a regular, what I always mention to the athletes I have that feel like they want to lose weight, I'm like, no, you go to deficit a weekly average of 500 to 750 calories per day. That's where you want to stop, right? You don't want to go anything over that, or like you had mentioned, you go into that fat storing hibernation where you actually start gaining, and you're like, I don't understand. I'm not eating as much. I'm not taking in as much fuel. I'm working out like a madman, but I'm gaining weight. Well, yeah, it's because any little piece of food you got, you're storing it. So you can actually, that's where that happens, right? But that's exactly where, I mean, I think that where I felt reds was that, I had been, I'd swim or bike or run every single day, 2 sports per day, all the time, at least an hour apiece. And yeah, after a few weeks, I was dead at work.
Mm.
Like I didn't want to go to work, and I loved my job. Didn't want to go to work. I wanted nothing to do with it, you know. But I knew that next morning I had to get up, I get my workout in, and you start to go into this fog, and then all of a sudden you start to feel sick, and then all of a sudden you get injured, um, because what's going on is your muscles aren't being recovered. You're not getting the extra protein that you need in order to repair what you've torn apart the day before. So I just wanted to put that out there because this is where we talk about it, where you've got somebody that's just starting, right? And they're like, oh no, I'm going to start. I'm running 3 miles a day. You know what? You running 3 miles a day could cause you overtraining as much as those athletes that's running 20 miles a day because they've been working up to it. So it is definitely individual. at that point. So I just want to put that out there. Um, but what I learned about Reds the first time was when I don't remember if it was an article, it was a book or something, but it actually started with gymnasts. Like
Mm.
they were the ones that actually that I mean that's where the focus was because you've got these kids that have been working out and being in the gym since they were 5 years old, and they're going and going and going, and all of a sudden, I mean, they're 15 years old and they look like they're 10. So there's this growth, um, this growth diminishing of growth at that point because this would happen. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, that you're not actually, you're not evolving physically because of overtraining. That's how bad this can get. So if you want to elaborate more on that,
Mhm.
yeah, I would love it. I would love to. So you probably have more of the science than I do on it, but yeah, that's where heard about it, and I think that's a great example. You see these gymnasts for me it was uh, oh, what was her name? Dominique Moceanu, 1984 Olympics, and she was 14 years old. She looked like she was 9. She was fantastic, but she looked like she was 9, you know? And then some of these gymnasts, all of a sudden, they get hurt, like really bad, where they've got to take like 5 months off. And all of a sudden, they come back, and all of a sudden, they don't look 9 anymore. You know, they've formed their curves have come out because they're not overtraining anymore. Become more curvy. They kind of grow because they're not doing this training anymore. They're not trying to keep this weight down. But that is, I think that's the extreme side of it.
Mhm. Yeah, and they have done a lot of research in terms of indicating that there's a predisposition to, or there's an increased like likelihood that someone will experience REDS in specific sports, and those tend to be the ones that are endurance sports, to your point, like ultra marathons or anyone that's doing like Ironman, like people that are doing like very high output, high demanding type of work. And also those where there's a lot of like aesthetic pressure. So I think this kind of goes back to what we were saying about cheer, where there are a lot of other sports or any sort of activities where there is pressure to look a certain way or to be presented in front of people or to wear a certain thing that can also impact the likelihood that people in those types of activities will be more likely to experience something like REDS. I think it's interesting though because to what we were talking about earlier, in regards to people across the spectrum being at risk of something like this, is that it is something that is not just reserved for people that identify as athletes. It's not just reserved for people that are identifying and doing and participating in a specific sport or activity. And the amount of, like, signs or signals that somebody could be experiencing are pretty broadly they're across the spectrum, and in some cases, it might be that somebody who is training or trying to get into exercise or trying to control their diet in a certain way might be really at risk because they aren't necessarily working with a team like a professional athlete, for example, in that other extreme, might be who's overseeing all of the stuff they're doing. And to your point, who has the time to be thinking about throughout the day exactly how they're going to manage their recovery and their nutrition and all those things, because that's maybe a bigger share of where they're dedicating their time and attention relative to somebody who is trying to train and work a job and parent and also maybe maintain other extracurricular activities that they enjoy. And so it's something where I think that it's underestimated how many people are experiencing this that aren't necessarily in like some sort of dedicated sport or activity. And it's something that can happen at various different stages of life. And I think to your point on like somebody who's new to training that might be just starting out and running, less than an ultra marathon or would, is still somebody that could be at risk. And sometimes it is in those points of transition in our lives where maybe we're taking on a new challenge or we're entering a new phase of life where we could be more at risk because we're making some of those changes, or we might be making a dedicated switch in our exercise or our nutrition in a way that we may not know what the consequences could be if we sustain that for a longer period of time.
Excellent. Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. So let's talk about specific symptoms,
Yeah.
you know. So if you can let's will you run through some of the specific when we talked about brain fog, we
Yeah.
talked about lethargy.
Yeah.
What other kind of symptoms does Reds what does Reds propagate with?
Yeah. And this is where it's pretty crazy how broad some of these symptoms could be. But it could be everything from digestive issues. So it could be something like everything from constipation to even bloating could be an experience that you have. But indigestion is one. They've noticed like frequent urination. And so also like temperature regulation. Like these are some of the physiological symptoms that I like to bring in, which is like feeling really cold all the time, or feeling like your hair is thinning, or maybe your nails are thinning could be another one. And increased illness, increased injury. So your immune system could be compromised. You could be getting sick more frequently. You could be having more injuries because you're not appropriately recovering or allowing your body and your muscles to repair. But also, it could be impacting your bone density. So you might be more likely to get something like a stress fracture, which I know, especially for like runners, that's like kind of one of the worst nightmare situations. Another one could be, especially for women or for people who are menstruating, that there could be disruptions in your hormones and in your menstrual cycle. So this could be everything from they're getting to be irregular to they start to go missing for months on end. And that's in the much more severe cases where if that's happening, then it is very it's indicating that there's a much more chronic issue that's occurring. But then even, like, going back to just some of the energy related ones that, feeling like in your training that you're burning out in your training, or that your motivation is decreased, or and this is kinda goes less from the physiological and even more into, like, the mental, where you might be experiencing more anxiety, you might be experiencing irritability or dips in your mood, or feeling like you're less motivated than you usually are. And these are really common things that I see in people that are coming to work with me or that are experiencing reds, that is oftentimes one of the things that, like, once you get to that state, you really want to get out of it because you're starting to feel like you're not yourself anymore. And so starting to notice the earlier signs, like how you're feeling in your training or how you're feeling at work, or whether or not you're feeling major energy dip. So you feel like you go for a longer workout and then all of a sudden your whole day is kind of shot. Those are some of like the earlier signs. And the unfortunate thing about it is I think that we've normalized just, if you can push through, just do it. Or we've normalized like, oh, well, there's a bunch of other reasons that could be happening. And so it probably isn't something that's a major issue. But getting this corrected sooner is better than waiting for these longer term symptoms that are impacting your immunity and then eventually maybe even like your cardiovascular functioning. So some of those signs are a mix between things that are gonna be more subtle and things that are, like, pretty clear. And the unique thing about Reds is that there's not, like, one clear thing where it's like every single person is going to experience this digestive issue, and then they're gonna experience this issue with temperature. It's, like, not as clear cut. And so sometimes it is a matter of really being able to tune in and identify where you might be seeing some of those patterns and mixing it together with some of the behavioral experiences that you're having to be able to make that assessment of like, "Oh, do I think that this is something that is, that could be impacting me?" And luckily, it's something that if you are experiencing it, it's completely manageable through lifestyle changes. And so because it is something that is being caused by the way that you're training or the way that you're feeling or the way you're navigating nutrition, that sometimes those changes aren't, it's not to say that those changes are necessarily easy, especially psychologically to make, but it is something where it can be corrected without needing necessary intervention from some sort of prescription or other sort of like rehab. In most cases, you can just navigate it through the changes that would correct for the overtraining and the underfueling.
So yeah, I get that. And what you were saying before is like the choices seem to be easy. And what I say to that is not easy. simple,
Right,
right?
exactly.
So they're simple, but they're not easy. In other words, hey, I know I need to increase my protein. That's simple, right? I just need to add more protein, but not easy
Right,
when
exactly.
you've got so much that you're already taking in, so much time that you've
Mhm,
got to eat, to prepare everything else, and also it's not easy. So and I love to just put that out there because it makes things realize that, hey, you know what? No, that's easy. All I got to do is this, blah blah blah. And but yeah, simple to diagnose, not easy to execute. So yeah, I get that because I'm one of those that found lack of protein, right?
mhm,
And that's exactly where I came in was motivation, right? I love to run, I love to cycle, about swimming. Um, but you know, I if I wasn't excited, if I just couldn't jump out of bed and be like, oh my God, today's a monster speed bike, you know, I mean, a speed special on my bike. You know, if I'm not excited about that, it was like, oh, you're burnt out. Oh, just do it anyway. And that's what you were saying before is we know about to push through. It's like, hey, you're all right. This happens, right? As soon as you get on your bike and get started, you're going to be fine. And 9 times out of 10, that was the case. But I feel worse the next day. And to a point where then it all of a sudden was, I don't want to go. And then I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do it. And then to the point where you're out running and you're going, why am I doing this to myself? And that not necessarily is that a psychological issue is what we provide as a norm. It's no, hey, if you don't want to do it, if you feel like you don't want to do it or you don't have motivation, get the motivation. Go out there, stick to it, no matter what. You get it done. No matter what, you get it done. And that's not the case anymore. We have to prioritize other things. Now, that's something that you profess, right? You
mhm,
prioritize um as a woman your regular menstruation,
mhm,
that your regular energy levels, and the whole bit, and you actually focus on that.
mhm.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came about um, deciding that that was the way to go, that was the focus versus metrics?
Yeah. And it's not to say that metrics don't matter because they definitely do in terms of, your vitals and also in terms of like your hormonal levels and also in terms of like how much sleep you got and also like your performance does matter, like how you're doing in training and a lot of the metrics that people are looking at are things like, what times did I get? How far did I go? And those things can still matter. And I think that it's still a balance. And I feel like a lot of times when we're over indexating on just metrics, that it's not always telling the whole story and it doesn't have all the information that we in our own bodies are experiencing. And sometimes that gets left out of the equation because it's not always tracked by a metric and because we have so much data now that it's easy to go fully metrics based. I think that's what you meant by metrics. Um, but so yeah, the approach that I took was much less about um I guess like I think that the other mistake that a lot of people make is focusing too much just on like calories in versus calories out, which is like, oh, I couldn't be experiencing this issue because at the very end of the day, if you're just going to tally everything up, then I'm pretty sure that I'm good. And one thing that really matters when we're talking about reds is this concept of energy availability. And it's actually in the name because red stands for like energy deficiency. And so, what we don't often think about a lot or enough is energy availability, which is really important when we're thinking about not getting into these states where our muscles can't repair or where we won't be experiencing these major energy dips or energy deficits. And that's not just something that's like a tally at the end of the day, as much as how we're thinking about nutrition over the course of the day, as well as to your point on like what we're having, which is all like from a high level broad stroke standpoint, we could be saying like from a macro standpoint, where if we're cutting out or restricting whole food groups or we're trying to follow a diet that is demonizing certain foods altogether, or we're just not thinking about it at all. And we're like mindlessly just having whatever is available and not realizing that if we're actually training at pretty high levels, that could be very much impacting how we're feeling and what is, how our muscles are responding to the exercise that we're putting it under. That all of those things are potential factors that could be influencing the the energy deficit that we could be experiencing. So the method that I really like to use really comes down to the foundation of going back to the principles that matter the most when it comes to recovery from REDs and prevention from REDs. And to your point, they tend to be fairly simple, but they're not always like super easy to implement. And that could be anything from like because you're thinking about things a different way. It could be because your routine is structured a certain way. It could be because mentally it's hard to overcome the barriers or because you are not used to doing things that way. But the energy availability piece is one of the most important components when it comes to preventing or recovering from a state like REDS. And it's also the framework that I like to use where we're working through how can we make sure that we're getting the energy needs that we're meeting the energy needs that we have and we're not over optimizing for things just because maybe we're talking about them online or because it's following a diet trend that was not relevant for a woman or not relevant for somebody who's active or maybe not relevant at all. Maybe it was completely misinformation. And where can we go back to the core principles that matter the most without getting too fixated or obsessive about how we're navigating food, because that can also be a beast that's very, very hard to come back from. And so finding that balance and being able to navigate it and feeling more empowered in how you're navigating nutrition, also how you're navigating your training is something that is very much core to how I work with people.
Nice. Yeah, and that's great is that to focus on that energy availability. Like I had mentioned before, I had found that I was feeling more in my calves, which I had never ever had a calf. 8 years, I'd never had a calf injury, never had a calf problem, never felt the strain. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was doing all the right things, right? I was dynamic stretching before, ballistic stretching after. You know what I mean? I was doing all the right things, but all of a sudden, calves. And then it was an ankle, and then it was a stress fracture, and I was like, well, what the heck is going on? Um, when I looked at my diet and looked at, my protein level, I was like, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try an experiment for the next 2 weeks. I'm going to add two protein shakes, two 20-gram, 25-gram protein shakes, right? With protein level. And once you know it, by that second week,
Mm-hmm.
motivation, my times were coming back. I was getting back to where my speed was, which I was losing. I wasn't getting the aches and pains anymore. Um, that was me, though. That individualized, that was me. For
Right.
some people, it might actually be carbohydrates.
Right.
There's this big, we've got this big, thing about carbohydrates being the worst thing for you.
Yeah.
It adds fat, it does this, you know what I mean? But but that's not conducive for an endurance athlete. So as lifestyle goes, you've got to take that into consideration. I've had some people that, were very big on cutting out their carbs, and all of a sudden times were going down, and it wasn't working. They looked great aesthetically from what you were saying before. I had a client that was doing 100 milers, and she was just starting to start that out, but she was like, I hate the way I look. Um, so we actually compromised, and this
Mhm.
brought that energy availability back to her. I was like, okay, listen, we're gonna pull this apart. We're gonna call your normal diet every day nutrition, and we're gonna call what you do for your running fuel. We're
Mhm.
just gonna divide it up in these two different categories. So for nutrition, she was doing keto,
Mm.
but for fueling, she was doing, she added a lot more carbs back, but it was only for fueling. So pre, during, and post had carbs in it, and then the rest of it she went keto. Until 3 days before the race. And 3 days before the race, I said, okay, now you're done with keto. Now you've got to start carbohydrate, loading on your carbohydrates. And it's going to be good because your body's been through this carbohydrate depletion, that they're going to be able to use the carbohydrates more efficiently. It was a 4-day race. Thursday was a 5K, Friday was a 10K, Saturday was a half marathon, and Sunday was a full marathon. It's called the Dopey Challenge. PR'd every one of them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's great.
PR'd every one of them. But again, specific to her,
Mhm.
right? We were able to compromise to keep her aesthetics, yet maintain her endurance training. And of course, this is what happened on Monday, right? On Monday, we debriefed, and I was just like, yeah, I'm excited about my times and the progress and stuff. But I looked at myself in the mirror this morning, and I don't like what I see. I said, Heather, wait 4 days, look in the mirror, and call me back.
Mm.
So she went back on regular nutrition, right? 4 days later, she calls me. She goes, "You're right."
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Yeah, and
so
I think to your point on individuality, it's the narrative that we, especially women, have to do low carb is one that's particularly dangerous. It's one of the most common, almost honestly, mistakes that I see. And so I really don't kind of buy into this notion that like the best aesthetic is achieved through only low carb. And I think that that narrative is what leads to so many women underfueling in carbohydrates specifically. And studies and reds have shown that if you are just restricting carb, so like let's say that you are getting enough fuel in other areas and you're getting enough nutrition on the other macros, but you're like not getting enough carbs, that can actually put you in a state where you're experiencing reds just on the carbohydrate side alone. And so it is one area where, to your point, I think that some of these like biases that we bring into our brain around how we are labeling certain foods as good as bad and bad can actually be impacting the nutrition decisions that we're making. And then that can also contribute heavily to experiencing something like this. And um there I just like to say that you can be eating a very fair amount of carbs and have very different body types, and there's a lot of other things that go into your aesthetic and what you're ultimately gonna look like, and so I don't like to equate like, okay, well, the only way to have a certain aesthetic is to, like, cut out carbs because that actually is something that can be a really dangerous decision to make.
yeah, and I agree, which is the reason why with Heather, I was like, no, you're going to eat carbs for fuel. So that's how I was able to maintain her carb load
Mhm.
during the week was that pre, during, and post, she had her carbs. So, and because we go overboard on carbs
Mhm.
for endurance athletes, she was actually able to maintain a sufficient weekly weekly carb, uh, fueling capacity, weekly carb capacity that she needed. So yeah, so that actually worked out really, really well. But that's again individual, right? That worked for her.
Mhm.
And I think you're absolutely right. There's some of these people that I've talked to that have like tried carnivore
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah.
tried keto and the whole bit where yeah, they look great, but they feel like utter crap.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, we need to find something. A lot of the people that I've talked to that have gone carnivore said the same thing. Like, right, the brain fog was gone. The brain fog was gone. I felt like they had brain power, but they were tired. Um, and their skin felt better, they looked better, but a lot of other things in their life were not up to their standards. And basically what I says is, okay, so though, how about you try carnivore and fruit once you add fruit back in?
Mhm.
And all of a sudden little things started to get better, 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 better. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but again, individual, right? Some people on carnivore, I mean, what's his name? Joseph Peterson. And his daughter, um, Peterson's. Anyway, he's a Canadian phys- uh, physician, psychiatrist, all over the news and stuff. He talks on all the major talk shows and stuff. And then his daughter had a lot of health issues growing up, and she says that she went carnivore and she basically only eats meat, and all those different things went away, like major issues went away. But again, individualized. So we all have different chemical makeup in my opinion.
Mm. Yeah, I
So
think yeah, individual um, definitely makes sense, and I think I love the changes that you made about reintroducing carbs, for some of the folks that you've worked with, because I think that that's definitely a mistake I see a lot of folks making, and that's why I think that there's sort of a component of this that can be educational, which is just like sometimes based on what we see either online or what we think that we see other people doing, we just underestimate either what we need to be having or how much we need to be having, or we're not we're just making decisions that aren't necessarily aligned to like what we actually need. And then there are instances where there's more of that like bias towards what we think is right or wrong. And I think that oftentimes when folks are, to your point on individuality, there's also individuality in terms of like what people's goals are and what their motivators are. And the goal of performance and wanting to do really, really well in a specific event is very different from a goal where somebody is really interested in their aesthetic, which is really different from a goal where someone's interested in feeling a certain way. And I think that how we are crafting um, the programming and the support and what that is going to look like and the lifestyle modifications for each person is going to vary based on their goals as well, which can be very individualized. And one of the things that I find to be really interesting about Reds is that it's one of those things where pretty agnostic of what your goals are, it's really great to not be experiencing Reds.
Oh,
And so
100%.
I think that that's like one thing that I think is kind of amazing and fun about the work that I get to do with people who are potentially struggling with this or definitely struggling with this is that some of the benefits end up being really like clear and pronounced for people, even in areas that they may not have suspected at the time, but also that it can be something that can be really beneficial for goals on a very broad set of the spectrum because of how many influences that could have in someone's life. So definitely hear you on the individuality and how like complex that can be for people and what they're trying to do and also what works for them. And that's why I also think that there's so much power in being able to understand not just, what do people online think are going to work in a very broad strokes advice for everyone in every single situation versus being able to differentiate and be empowered with, all right, well, here's what like scientifically backed makes sense for people based on, the fitness level you're at and the goals that you're trying to achieve, and feel like there's less um sort of like mental calculation and headspace that has to happen that's dedicated towards every single decision being right or wrong when you're navigating food and exercise, which can also be like a really just also like chronically stressful place to be where it feels like there's then like control that like you're exerting over every single decision you're making, especially because food is something that we face every single day. At least most of us when we're not like fasting in any sort of way. And so having a relationship with food, which is also a key part in a lot of what I focus on when we're going through red support and red's recovery is that component of like, what is your relationship like with exercise? What is your relationship like with food? Because for many, many, many of us, that can be a very complex topic and like a complex like relationship we have in our lives.
I get that. I get that. So let's talk a little bit more about Allie right now. Are you training for anything right now?
I am not training for anything right now.
Okay.
I through the work that I do, I'm helping a lot of people who are training for the New York City Marathon, which is really exciting. But
Nice.
yes, yeah, but I'm really grateful to not be training. I did like a bunch of half marathons earlier this year. Let's say like March through May, and kind of got a lot of that out of my system. And now I'm like, I'm happy to be training for helping other people train for the upcoming marathons that are coming up this fall.
I totally get that as well. When I first started coaching, it was like I used to say, "Oh my God, just a very close second to that feeling of crossing a marathon, crossing a finish line, is watching my clients cross the finish line."
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it became the other way around. All of a sudden it was like, no, 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 no. I'm much, much happier. I get such a bigger jolt out of watching clients cross the finish line, PR, PB, and the distant second is me crossing the finish line. So I 100% get that. But for everybody else, so Allison,
Yeah.
has a, I gotta find it. Here it is. She has a website and she calls it the allymethod.com.
It's ally.
So,
Yeah, the ally method.
oh, ally method.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Um, well, I mean, it's, it's you. So it kind of looks like it.
No, totally fair. Totally fair. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So the ally method.
Hmm.
So you want to take a look at the allymethod.com, and she has consultations, and she's got some different ideas and some information on reds. So take a look at that. And you can, if you're feeling like anything that we've talked about today, if you've got some of these symptoms that we mentioned about reds, definitely give Allison a call. Take a look at her website, contact her, she's got a free consultation on there, and get involved, and maybe she can, and she'll help you get through this. And you're going to be better off for it. You're going to start realizing that you're going to realizing your goals again. You're going to feel better. And you're going to be, and then obviously, as you listen to Allison, she's very educated. So you'll end up being very educated, which is great. So definitely take a look at that. And oh, okay, these are the rest of those. She's on a bunch of other podcasts that you can take a look at. She's got as featured inside of her site. And of course, then it looks like you've got like a newsletter or something.
Yes. Yeah. So if people are interested, they can always sign up or on my newsletter, and I send out information about reds, and I love answering people's questions. So you can connect with me there, or also on Instagram. And I love to hear from folks.
Excellent. I appreciate that. And do you spend the time on LinkedIn too?
I do. Yeah. So if folks want to come and hang out on LinkedIn, I'm there as well. So
Yeah. So,
yeah.
but you're right on. You're perfectly in the first the two things. I mean, at least in this audience, I've seen that most of them are either on Instagram or on LinkedIn. Not a lot on TikTok, and Facebook is Facebook. But we appreciate it. We so appreciate you coming on and giving us all that. I will make sure that this is all linked in the notes, so you'll be able to get her address and her socials. That'll be in the notes. And we really appreciate you and what you're doing, Allison. I thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Me too. So for the rest of you, if you like what was going on here, please, if you're watching the video, then, hit that like bar and subscribe, and hit the little bell thing there so you know when the next episode's coming up. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify, please leave a review. And I don't care whether it's good or bad, just leave one. And so because if it's bad, you'll tell me what's going on, and I'll be able to make this podcast evolve so that I can just keep making it better and giving you more and more information to making you have the best life that you can possibly have and live up to your potential. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.